Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Arc, and we're very happy to be kickstarting it with the first presentation, which is perhaps the most pertinent question of the last 2 years, which is what do we learn about social protection when in times of crisis? Here I have my panel with me, which is a part of the bigger team that put together 2 exceptional reports on the types, the kinds, the modes, and the modalities of relief that happened in the first year, which was 2020 in India. And what this group was, which is a part of the bigger group, the other authors you can read on the slide displayed at the moment, is that it was a mix of people who were actually helping relief reach the ground, and then some of us who were working on social protection as a concept for a long period of time. So this project actually came about in a very organic way as a mix of these 2 kinds of people coming together to say, what does this time of crisis teach us about social protection and vice versa? The way this presentation will proceed is we'll have opening remarks. We have 2 different reports that we are presenting, which is a part of the bigger work on relief. The first report focuses on state actors in state relief. The second report actually focuses on non-state actors. I needn't perhaps underline the exceptional role that non-state actors played. Individuals, NGOs, membership-based organizations, institutions that refashioned themselves in this crisis for relief to reach on ground. And therefore, we thought it was a compelling set of practices that we needed to document. So these are the 2 different reports within this larger frame. And we'll have some concluding remarks from Gautam, after which we'll open it up for questions and answers. People online, joining us online, there should be a chat box in which you can put in your questions and we'll be taking them up in the Q&A after the panel presentation.
Sorry, Kinjal, just 1 second. For folks online, just to use the Q&A and not the chat box because of the Zoom format. Sorry.
Yes. So as the title of this slide suggests, that we're actually looking back at the 2 years of relief that was extended, exceptional, maybe not extensive, maybe not comprehensive, but truly exceptional, to actually think about what does it mean, what does it say about our social protection systems in general. So these are 2 very different concepts. Relief is episodic, social protection is not episodic, social protection is supposed to be structural, transformatory, all of it. And just to give a perspective, for a country that spends about 2 lakh crores, let's say, give or take, on individual and household-based social protection, the first announcement of the Garib Kalyan Yojana, which was again mainly focusing on food and cash transfers, was about 1.7 lakh crore. This was the first announcement. The total package of Garib Kalyan Yojana was akin to 4 lakh crores just from the central government. We are not even talking about the state relief packages. So the very first announcement was your annual budget of social protection, which was there for 3 weeks, supposed to be given for the 3-week lockdown. And to us, that was also telling us where we stand on, what is the ground we stand on when it comes to social protection. And therefore, these set of reports look at these 3 things. These are the 3 things we actually focus on, which is 1, as I said, what does relief tell us about social protection? How do we, the operational modes, how do we actually be able to deliver relief in complex and constrained situations? Now, this has lessons for how delivery mechanisms for regular social protection in non-exceptional times can happen better, can happen faster, and can happen more efficiently. And exactly, how do we now move on to improve? So what are the gaps and what are the opportunities that this kind of an episode teaches us about bettering our social protection systems? The reason why it's really interesting to look at this time is who were we trying to actually track? These people, the relief was to be directed at those who were extremely mobile, And it's amazing. It was a time when there were individuals who were very mobile. They were moving despite the lockdown. And then there were real restrictions on mobility for the first time. We actually saw state boundaries become boundaries where you couldn't cross them for the first time. And therefore, I think who we were trying to locate was this very difficult individual who was beyond the regulatory frameworks, who was mobile across region, who was not in all databases that one would hope to find them in, and the places they worked in. So even if you went spatially to look for them, even if spatial approach may inherently have certain exclusions to them, these were difficult spatial locations to go to reach in ordinary times, forget times like COVID. So, and therefore, the three things the two reports will talk about is the processes of identification and verification, one of the most contested territory of social protection, not just in India, but maybe many countries of the global south and everywhere where universal protections are not extended. Who is eligible? How is the person eligible to be enlisted? And how do you verify the person who's enlisted is the one who's getting the relief? Sounds pretty simple, but it's not as straightforward. Defining the entitlement, this became very important. To give an example, do you give a dry ration kit or do you give cooked meals? Was one of the most challenging questions we were facing at that point of time. It depended on the recipient's ability to be able to, at that point, receive the entitlement in the form that it was given. So the form of entitlement became a big question at a time when people didn't have access to their own homes, they didn't have access to their workplaces, and they were mobile and on the road. The modes of delivery. Where do you deliver it? At the house, at the workplace, at the place that they were stuck at? On national highways, one of the big sites of relief was actually highways. So I think these are some of the questions that we deal with through our reports. Finally, I just want to take a moment to say what these both reports relied on in terms of where they looked for this kind of a rich archive. The first one is looking at 181 announcements, and I want to clarify that all of these announcements had to do with either individual-based relief or household-based relief. And they particularly looked at food, cash transfers, and labor regulations, but not labor regulations at the level of the enterprise, labor regulations at the level of the individual labor. Okay, so it does carry that exclusion in it. And the period we looked at was from March 20 to May 31, which is the end of the 4-phased lockdown that we had at the early part of COVID, the first wave. The second one is the non-state actors has looked at 42 actors across the country and covered anywhere from between individuals to organizations, non-profit organizations, and citizens collective to be able to create this really vast archive that we are going to look at. Finally, I think our aim with this presentation is to push the envelope on conversations on social protection, to actually present that relief as recovery and recovery as resilience, and resilience as the first step that we think towards social transformation. So I think from here I'll move to Nidhi, who will take us through some of the aspects of state actors report.
Thank you, Kinjal. When we say state actors, we mean all central and state undertakings. This may include governments, departments, agencies, parastatals. And we looked at 20 government orders by the central government and 161 government orders by the state government, again across food support, cash transfers, and labor protection. Now, coming to how they were identifying beneficiaries, there were 7 key ways we found that were employed. The first was the use of existing databases, which are used, databases in which people were already enrolled before the crisis. So let's say ration systems, being enrolled in PDS, being enrolled in ESIC, being part of construction workers boards, etc. And The thing over here is that the entitlement that was offered was the same as it was before crisis. So those who had ration cards were delivered ration, were able to access dry ration kits. Another example of this is cash transfers for registered construction workers. The second kind is enrolling those who are adjacent to a database. Now, this is clearly, so examples of this would be a pending registration or those who have recently expired their registrations. Now, clearly this is because it was difficult to reach everybody given just those who were already registered in databases. So they had to expand the category to include those who were not in the system. A critical part over here is that details from applicants were used for verification. Verification was a critical part of this mechanism. And example of this would be insured people under ESIC who recently had expired their registration and they were able to avail medical benefits. So again, the entitlement remains the same as it was before the crisis, and the criteria remain also unchanged. The third category is expanding the database by creating, either conducting new surveys. This is primarily to make up for wrongful exclusions. So people who were erstwhile left out of databases but were, key point over here is, still eligible under those categories. So the criteria still remain unchanged. It's only that the database is being expanded. An example here is ration cards for families who are eligible but do not have a ration card still. I would like to note again that for categories 2 and 3, verification was a critical part of this deployment. So, and I'll repeat it, that applications were already with the state actors. So they were able to use these details to verify whether these applicants were eligible or not. The fourth category is to use an existing database, but not for the purpose that it was created. So an example would be all construction workers and casual labor in a government order by Uttar Pradesh were considered, as the government order states, vulnerable and needy, two words which we don't usually associate to as statutory categories. And these databases were taken from Manrega and Labour Department, and they were used to for deduplication with the PDS database. So you see who is being vulnerable and needy by using occupational categories as a proxy for need. And then you sort of combine them with PDS exclusion categories and distribute relief. So what we see happening over here is the database is pre-existing, but the way it is being used is as a proxy for something else. Other examples of this could be to create new data, to deploy those who have ration cards but do not have like a certain category of entitlement. A critical point over here is that these were used for one-time special entitlements. These were not something which were made part of the system. So this is a space which is an opportunity for thinking about using databases from different systems to expand the ambit of social protection and provide entitlements of various kinds. The fifth category is new databases with expanded criteria. So till now, what we've been talking about, the criteria remain unchanged. So you have to be eligible using this within the same criteria that have been set pre-crisis. Now, in this category, new databases are created using expanded criteria. So an example of this is insurance for frontline workers under Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. So there is no database that exists before this. This frontline workers category included those who are healthcare workers working in state or central undertakings, those who work in hospitals, nurses, people who are working for distribution of ration, etc. So these are categories we have not seen in the past, and they're not statutory categories, but new databases are hence created for deployment of relief. A thing over here which was used was also negative exclusion. So those who were not part of something, but deduplication was used with those criteria. Let's say someone who does not have access to ration cards. You create a database of those people who do not have ration cards. So to this effect, new surveys were created. Self-identification was a way that was used, where state governments in Sikkim and Manipur, if I'm not wrong, invited people who needed assistance in dry rations to sort of enroll themselves on government databases. Another way this was deployed was the Delhi government using elected representatives to distribute food coupons. So it was left at the discretion of elected representatives to create new databases. The sixth category is where there is no database. So it is a universal demand-driven distribution system, which is employing what delivery mechanisms the state actors already have in place. So examples of this would be cooked food delivery or state canteens that were sort of distributed using or delivered using schools or space-based points for a more universal delivery. It was not looked at who the beneficiary is, but it was still a point to be noted, was controlled and scrutinized in other ways. The size of the entitlement really is what determined how universal these things could be. What we did note in our study of government orders is that the entitlement in such universal systems was usually small. So something like a cooked food delivery as compared to a 5-kilo ration kit. This is critical to consider because the state actors are then looking to avoid two things. One is wrongful inclusion and also false exclusions. So what they're doing is they're kind of using the size of the entitlement as a way to regulate that they're not being appropriated or being redistributed to the same people. The seventh kind is where there was a database missing, and the state actors actually directed other actors, non-state actors, to sort of take or suspend action to handle the crisis. Examples of this would be government orders asking landlords to forgo rent, or government orders asking employers to support their employees. What is critical here is that risk is offsetted from one person, one kind of a group to another. So landlords are also sort of not given a support system in which they can forgo rent and still make ends meet. So is the case with employers of smaller enterprises. So the question really here is, can this kind of a relief be considered meaningful when there is no provision or delivery ensured by the state and everything is sort of offsetted, all responsibility is offsetted to a non-state actor? Do you still call this relief provision by state actors then? A critical point over here again to make is that across these categories, we see that the entitlement differed. So they were differentiated entitlements. What we found is we created this category or a concept of robustness of one's presence in a database. So for instance, someone who is adjacent to a database might not have the same entitlements or the same kind of entitlements as someone who's already in an existing database.
I pointed that side or pointed forward?
Can you click on the presentation once? Now.
Something to reiterate over here regarding the possibility of social protection expanding is that new categories and new processes were devised in this method. This was a response to crisis, but it offers a lot of opportunity for us to rethink what social protection could expand to. As you can see on the slide, there were certain already existing categories like card holders of ration or pension or rural job card holders. There were new work categories that were created through new surveys like transport workers, street vendors, construction workers. Point to be noted over here is they're all registered, so they had to be part of certain boards or databases already. But most critically, the new categories that we see across government orders springing up: stranded, distressed, daily wage, migrant, casual, contractual, students, migrants again, marginal sections of the society who are deprived of their daily wages. So these categories are an opportunity for social protection to expand beyond what are currently statutory or governmental categories, and for it to become more universal, one, and for it to become more customized to the needs of these specific categories. I will now let Neha take you over.
Yeah, thanks, Nidhi. How much time do I have?
About 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Okay. So thanks. So with Nidhi having set it up like that, I'll just sort of take on the question of what the entitlement was. Sorry. No, that's not how it goes. Yeah. So the question of what entitlement was given is sort of pretty closely linked and does overlap with the modalities of how beneficiaries were identified. But the main sort of point to make is really that the robustness of what already existed, of previously existing social protection systems, determined the possibilities, the possibilities for what was imagined as possible, the possibilities and nature of relief. So as Nidhi said, the beneficiary is in a database for a specific entitlement such as food, and you receive that entitlement. It's fairly straightforward. Ration card holders receive ration. Those registered under the PMUI receive sort of financial assistance for gas cylinders. But so really the point to note here that I want to make is that within this mode of imagining social protection relief is constrained by pre-existing forms of social protection entitlements. So these known need and work categories that Nidhi spoke about, as much as it applies to identifying beneficiaries, applied itself as much to the stuff itself, to the entitlement itself. And I also want to just highlight that sometimes the entitlement itself did vary. So Kerala offered mental health support and home delivery of food and ration and stuff like that. But on the whole, the form of entitlement remained the same as the purpose of whatever database you were in. The question of delivering entitlements, again, is kind of a closely linked point. Again, the amount of relief needed and the effectiveness. Now, while our study didn't really go into effectiveness and implementation, we do want to make the point that it's inversely proportional to the strength of public institutions in any state. And scholarship in the years since, in the two plus years since, has come to support that as well. It varied really across states. There's a great paper called Destinations Matter, which talks about migrant experiences and how it varied by the social protection systems in each state. So existing public institutions, regardless of whether they were designed to deliver a specific social protection entitlement or not, were the single most important factor determining the effectiveness of state relief. So I have a few examples of ways in which public institutions could behave. So either you could hold expanded benefits within the same form that they were designed for, such as PDS shops storing and distributing extra allocations of grain, or you could offer databases that could be used for other benefits, as Nidhi sort of hinted upon. Public institutions could be repurposed to deliver benefits that they weren't really designed for, so such as schools in Delhi that became centers for ration and cooked food distribution. But also a public institution could ensure spatial outreach to vulnerable communities. So for example, Kerala's community kitchens or Anganwadi centers in low-income neighborhoods. But the principle remains the same. What the study emphasizes is that the criticality of existing infrastructure to deliver sort of social protection in these exceptional circumstances. So the presence of like fair price shops proved vital in terms of acting as last mile infrastructure. But also, we touch on this really briefly in the report, the role of Narega in terms of absorbing, being able to absorb, sort of incoming migrants. So I think they issued job cards as well as they announced the creation of new works in order to absorb these incoming migrants into the workforce. But there's no question that it wasn't enough, but these are some of the things that we see. Let's see what's next. Yeah, so this question of layering, again, we go into the nuances of what layering means and why it matters in the report, but really here the point I want to make is that no database architecture exists that approaches social protection from this integrative approach. So integrating needs across food, wage, rent, healthcare. Instead, as we've seen, each type of entitlement has its own database, delivery system, institutional architecture. In the absence of any robust database, it was at the discretion of the state governments to implement food and cash delivery to reach sort of maximum beneficiaries. So we also had an example of Tamil Nadu's delivering cash transfers of 1,000 rupees through identification of rice-only ration cards, which was sort of a proxy for need. And yeah, Uttar Pradesh did something similar as well. I'll just move on to the next. Yeah, so this, again, we didn't really go into the question of adequacy, like it wasn't the central focus of the study, but we did feel the need to ask, or at least compare some of the effective daily amount of some of these relief measures, like even compared to the state's own like daily wage figures for Narega and so on. And we have a list of much longer, like 90 comparators, but I just wanted to share this much. We divided the amount by 90, which was sort of 3 months, and we really, I really feel like it's pretty stark in terms of an effective per day amount. What does it even mean to be getting 7 rupees per day? And I also want to just say that in the report and based on the RMKU work, we also include the question of rent in terms of thinking about adequacy of relief. I'll skip over the details, but the point is really that if sort of cash transfers have to be meaningfully adequate, it has to be as close to 7,000 rupees as possible. That's what we said 2 years ago. Arguably 2 years later, it is quite increased. And also, I want to briefly touch on what was missing, like what was not given and why. So while we say that like state actors themselves recognized, sectors as critical vulnerabilities such as housing insecurity or unemployment and stuff. But as Nidhi suggested, as Nidhi suggested with the question of rent, there were no really existing modalities, existing means or programs to handle questions of a rent moratorium and so on. Is that time? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I think I'll leave it at that then. I just wanted to make, with that I'll pass it to Pooja. Thanks so much, yeah.
Thanks, Neha. So with the non-state actors, I think we learned a lot more than we thought we would when we started interviewing about 42 of these organizations. Of course, it was purposive sampling because it was dependent on how much we were able to access people, and a lot of people who were engaged in relief were also extremely occupied. So I just want to take you through the base with which we started. Essentially, we spoke with NGOs that had an existing beneficiary base. We spoke with different kinds of unions. We also spoke with citizen collectives, some of which didn't exist before the pandemic and came into light only then. There was also this interesting concept of a lot of individuals doing things. And some of these were also people who had a lot of influence in the smaller groups that they belonged to. So they were able to organize resources, they were able to help reach relief much faster than the government and some of the organized NGOs were able to. We also looked at different types of entitlements. One is, of course, food, both cooked food and ration kits. This happens to be the biggest in terms of the amount of relief that was provided. There was travel support, both in the form of money transfers to go back home, some of which also involved like booking simple things like bus tickets for people to go back. Health, medical, mental health support, and there was also housing support. This again, as much as it was for the state actors, this was a very small chunk in the pie. In terms of geographies, of course, because of the nature of organizations we were speaking with, a lot of them were urban, but we also came across a few rural actors, and also, I mean, in terms of geography, the national highways became an important one to consider, which wasn't the case in the first lockdown, right? And in terms of the beneficiaries, a bunch of people, but mostly migrant laborers, because they were the most affected, residents of informal settlements, different kinds of groups that were in minority. Coming to how we sort of understood, the non-state actors going about which database to use, who do they reach out to, and a point to make here is that for non-state actors, this wasn't a priority when they started, because the focus was to be agile, the focus was to reach as many people as possible. Having said that, there were two large categories, and some of these overlap with the state actors as well. One is organizations that had some form of an existing database. This could be in the form of membership lists. For instance, an organization like Seva, which already has a membership base, knows who to reach out to first. There were also organizations that didn't have membership but had worked with beneficiaries in the past, so they had some sort of list they could go back to. Apart from this, there was a huge set of people who needed to collect new data. So just like in the state actors, a lot of rapid surveys were conducted, demand-based help was provided, partnerships were made with hyperlocal organizations, and even more ad hoc methods like reaching the national highway, right? The thing to note here is that in comparison to the state actors, the agility and flexibility here was much higher because they were not restricted by, legislations and such. So they were able to tailor things much faster than the state actors. They were also sort of the relationship that existed on the state side also holds true here, that organizations which were established, had a beneficiary database, were able to effect change much faster and in larger volumes than those that didn't. Coming to the criteria which different organizations used to identify beneficiaries, one was, of course, vulnerability, any form, right? Occupational, social. Another, and this was a very interesting factor that we noticed, is the factor about exclusion. Here, a lot of NGOs started helping beneficiaries who did not have a ration card or who did not have an Aadhaar card, because they were being left out definitely from state relief. So that sort of became their focus to start with. And of course, location, depending on where they were, vulnerable communities. The last category, of course, is donor preference. And this happened a lot in the case of situations where money was coming from CSRs, money was coming from corporates, because if they largely worked with women, then they wanted to sort of, continue to work on those lines. So they would work on providing sanitary napkins, or if they were people who worked on mental health, then they wanted to continue that line of work. So it also depended a little bit on where the money came from. In terms of verification and prioritization of beneficiaries, I think in comparison to the state actors, this wasn't a priority at all for non-state actors when they began. Like I said, the idea was to reach as many people as possible. But as the lockdown sort of progressed, they realized that there were people who were accessing benefits sometimes more than once, and there were others who weren't getting it even once. So then they started sort of doing spot checks, understanding, building lists, ensuring that two NGOs are not helping the same set of beneficiaries. So this became more and more sort of clear in the later lockdowns and not before. Coming to the types of relief that people were providing, we tried to develop a matrix here in order to understand, the forms of relief that were most effective, most agile. We've broken down the food relief more because that happens to be the bigger chunk. So there were two factors we considered. One is the organization's capacity to reach beneficiaries. The second one was the beneficiaries' ability to access this, right? And we mapped out a few factors like whether the benefit would require mobility or not, whether it would be influenced by the use of technology. So for instance, one example is for cooked ration, right? Because a lot of the NGOs at this time had passes to move around the city. They were able to move and provide this, but if they were, for instance, going to help somebody on the highway, it wasn't a very easy thing to do because government had restrictions on that kind of movement. So essentially a different set of factors affected different kinds of relief. On the beneficiaries end, like we already spoke, being in a list, not being in a list, having a bank account, being able to even access some of these benefits made a huge difference. Finally, coming to how all of this was layered and what kind of customization organizations used, we saw that, and this was very interesting to see, that organizations that were already working with a certain set of beneficiaries were able to do more, but also do better. One instance here is that one of the NSAs that was working in Bangalore had a beneficiary base. They would work with the transgender community, and they ensured that there were two sets of ration kits that were given, one with a rice option and the other with a wheat option, right? Just to cater to where people came from within the country. Whereas for the newer organizations, this was much harder to do, let alone the state actors. Yeah, so I think with that, I'd like to hand over to Rashee for the delivery section.
Yeah, I've already made it disappear.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
So after, the process of verification, vetting where, who the beneficiaries are, the question of defining entitlements comes in. What are we going to give to the people, the beneficiaries that have been identified by the non-state actors? So we're going to focus on food relief for the purpose of this presentation. And so there were 4 ways in which, food entitlements were given to beneficiaries. One was delivery of cooked food to households, running of community kitchens, distribution of dry ration kits, distribution of cooked food packets, and also there were experiments with direct cash transfer. So we wanted to assess what forms of entitlements, for example, how do you decide where you're going to give cooked food versus a dry ration kit? What are the ways in which those kind of decisions very quickly had to be made? And like Pooja also said, the non-state actors were able to really be flexible in their approach in how they were going to reach the beneficiaries in this. The other was the assessment of viability to understand what determined which form of entitlement had to be given. So if somebody was walking on the highways, then you want to get dry food packets because God knows when they're going to find the next stop where they're going to get, a top up of the food that they have. As opposed to, say, dry ration kits. If people had access to spaces, kitchens, they wanted to start cooking themselves. They also think that this is happening at the height of summer in India. So, how are we going to sort of, what is the viability of the entitlement and how we're going to do that? And then, of course, the assessment of specific advantages of non-state actors versus, state relief, which was more confined to sort of, set delivery mechanisms, to set delivery chains, and how they were able to sort of break away from that and, sort of reach beneficiaries quicker. So this is something that we've sort of mapped in our report. And, so what is the mobility, so for example, if you're going to look at cooked food delivery within a community, then do we need mobility permissions? Because there was a lockdown in the country. What is the resource stability in size? How are we going to be able to create, how are we going to get the resources, cook them, then distribute them, sub-distribute them, etc. What is the frequency of delivery? So in cooked food, that was very high. So it's almost daily. So much like the state actors, where there were daily food centers in government schools, for example, in Delhi, community kitchens also were doing this daily. So you had community kitchens which gave food once, there were some that gave twice. So it was daily. So you were looking at a kind of resource generation and distribution on a daily basis, as compared to, say, giving a dry ration kit, where you gave a ration kit to a family and then you knew that for the next 3 to 4 weeks, that's not going to be something that you're going to have to go back to them for. And of course, the size of the delivery chain. So, where is the procurement coming from? How are we going to? So in these lockdowns, if you're able to get, say, food material, but if you're going to have a more complex sort of a ration kit that you've devised, then where is the procurement going to come from? So we were told that as the lockdowns continued week after week, the availability of oil went down. So where are you going to procure oil from if you're going to give a dry, ration kit? So such questions sort of came in and were really quickly sort of, in that moment, in that sort of flux, the non-state actors were looking for answers to some of these questions. Next slide, please. And like Pooja said, what the non-state actors were able to do really well was customization, layering, and modification of entitlements. So, we are looking at layering of relief with other intersectionalities, right? Like Pooja mentioned, transgender communities. So people working on gender. Suddenly you have people who are working on women's issues saying, we need to have menstrual hygiene kits in our ration kits. People were looking at age. So non-state actors that worked in communities that knew that had a large population of young children, and because the Anganwadis were shut at that point of time, they knew and they assessed very quickly that the children's nutritional sort of, needs at that time are not being met. So very quickly adding dry powdered milk, adding eggs to the ration kits where they knew that the children were sort of, a community that had many children. The customization of ration kits also was because of familiarity of region, like I said, very simply put, between North India, South India, swap wheat for rice, etc. But also more sort of layering. So, you had culinary preferences of people who were migrants in a different city. So sort of be cognizant of that. The non-state actors were able to move very quickly and sort of understand and grasp that and say, if this is a migrant from the south of the country, stuck in the north of the country, how are we going to do this? Also with wheat, one of the things was that the mills were shut at that point of time. So how do you kind of, work around some of these issues, etc. Religious identities played a role. There were many who's, this was also happened to be the time of Ramzan. Many sort of people who were doing the ration kits or delivering ration kits to Muslim populations at that point of time said they added cardamom, they added milk, they added vermicelli, because they said that, in this time of despair, you want a little something for people to hold on a little bit longer. So, like we said, unlike state actors who were structured into large-scale single-chain delivery mechanisms, NSAs were able to really customize, layer, look at the way that really quickly adapt their sort of entitlements. Next slide, please.
Just a couple of minutes.
Okay, so we're looking at the delivery of these entitlements. So once you have entitlements, how do you deliver them? So we have delivery chains. So if you look at, this is something that's in our report as well. So if you look at dry food packets, these were sort of required the longest delivery chains as compared to direct cash transfers. And cash transfers over here were happening in incredibly sort of interesting ways where you'd send the beneficiary to a local Kirana store and just UPI the payment to the Kirana store and say, can you please give them what they need and we're going to give you the money. And that really cut down the delivery chain very rapidly. But of course, it had its own sort of challenges of who has a mobile phone, who's going to be able to go to a Kirana shop, and will the Kirana shop owner have trust with somebody else who's sitting somewhere and saying, we're going to give you this money. So we looked at delivery chains. Next, please. And then, of course, there is the question of resource stability. Again, the small versus big non-state actors were able to sort of, make that kind of, because they had the resources. And we are talking about resources, not just financial, but also manpower. Who's going to go and do this kind of delivery? And also how we call it the thickness of their presence in communities. How deeply were they embedded in these communities to be able to get to them quickly? And that also formed part of the resource base. There's mobility and permissions. Again, people who wanted to go to the highways, how are you going to do that versus if you're going to work within the city or within a certain geographical region. Again, non-state actors that were embedded with governments were able to sort of get permissions quickly. Smaller non-state actors relied on really sometimes great personal risk, sometimes building rapport with the police, etc. And of course, then there is technological use. Like I said, UPI being used, WhatsApp groups coming together very quickly, even within communities. So we have to say that at this point of time, communities that were mobilized were sort of already pre the crisis of the pandemic. were able to create WhatsApp groups, were able to talk to each other, and able to guide the non-state actors and to where the need was and what exactly the need was. And of course, the identities of beneficiaries. These are, of course, they had both positive and negative effects. We have examples where Muslim volunteers who went into a Bangalore community to distribute food relief were turned away, or in Delhi, because you have to realize that at this time we'd also had communal violence just before the set-in of the lockdown. Many Muslim volunteers were stopped by the police. They were checked, and it was haphazard, but there is still, prejudices and identities still form a big core of how this was delivered. And of course, the nature of partnerships. These were not formal partnerships at all. People were coming together at a time of crisis for a shared goal. They just wanted to be able to reach beneficiaries. So that is, again, something that has to be looked at in the long term in terms of social protection. Do these sort of partnerships continue post the crisis? Are they important then? Or do they only come when there is a crisis like a pandemic, and not the everyday crisis that exists in India vis-a-vis sort of access to social protection? Next, please. So really quickly, implications and lessons. Non-state actors have to be viewed as social infrastructures. They have to be viewed just beyond just as filling gaps or as last mile connectivity. We show, because the Supreme Court said it, many other sort of people viewed that the work of the non-state actors happened really despite the state. Continued to happen, it was valuable, it's been acknowledged what happened in the first wave. And therefore, there are these learnings to sort of say that, this is non-state actors are not just present in, because of their everyday activisms, are present every day and therefore are, strong, solid social infrastructures for delivery of social protection policies, even in regular times. To support collectivization, because we saw large membership-based organizations, such as unions, were just better. They had the list, they had the resources, they had that kind of accountability. They got into the thick of things and were better prepared to tackle this crisis. The state and non-state actor partnerships and relief, again, we don't see many examples of this happening during the first wave. We don't have many. So we have some examples where non-state actors said yes when, say, for example, a certain item was missing. So we were able to reach, if they were embedded enough, we were able to reach the state and say, can this be made available? We have identified beneficiaries for this. So sort of looking at that kind of partnership to happen all the time. So looking at not just how the state actors did it, where if you are already registered in a database, do these partnerships work, but to make partnerships with, say, informal worker organizations, such as, say, domestic workers and not just construction workers, etc. And of course, importance of community organizing, not looking at communities as mere recipients, but also agents who can deliver social protection, and framework of accountability of non-state actors. So that where the state has accountability, how do we hold non-state actors accountable for the kind of work that they are clearly capable of doing? So, yeah.
So as you bring us to a close, one of the things we want to put out is to go back to the original questions that Kinjal raised for us as a team. And first to think about what is it that post-crisis social protection takes from relief. The first thing we have to say is that before we think about incremental improvements to our social protection system, the pandemic must be a moment where we recognize how broken our social protection system is. And I think that's one of our first findings. The quantum of relief is both an opportunity for improvement, but first it is evidence of the insufficiency of social support before crisis. We found everywhere, and this is our main second point you can see, no amount of relief can compensate for systemic social protection gaps pre-crisis. Relief cannot be seen as a way to say, we're all right, because if we have a crisis, we have all this mutual aid, we have all these new innovations. The argument to understand relief is in order to say that pre-crisis social protection systems must be stronger. There is no relief that can ever compensate for that, which means that the nature of the patchwork, and we're using this word particularly because we think it actually explains particularly urban social protection systems. There are systemic gaps, and the gaps are of particular time, which is to say that there are certain kinds of beneficiaries and citizens and workers that are missing. There are particular kinds of spaces in the city that are missing, and there are particular types of entitlements that are missing. And that means that the nature of the gaps in the patchwork is also particular. It's not an argument of saying increase the efficiency of social protection to reach more people. That will still not get us the universal that we want. So if we think of universal social protection as an ideal, the way we reach the universal has to have multiple strategies. And we'll come back to this in our last slide. And what's very important for us to say is a lot of states got a lot of attention for the amount of relief they did, which is a bit ironic because the states that did the least relief were not negligent. They were states whose pre-crisis social protection systems were better. So if you think about Kerala, the community kitchens did not have to be created because they existed. Delhi got a lot of praise, rightly so, for turning schools into hunger relief centers. But that's because the hunger relief centers did not pre-exist and schools had to be repurposed without a system of community kitchens, even though you had a system of ration food delivery. The second thing that's really important to think about state actors is that even before, we do a lot of talk in governance about two things, convergence and integration. And one of the things that's very important for us to understand is that relief work shows experiments in conversion. So when we say databases became proxies for each other, that rapid enrollment happened. A very simple point. The National Food Security Act limits enrollment into the PDS system for urban areas at 40%, even though for rural areas it's 60%. The logic of this is that vulnerability is lower. Food insecurity is lower in urban areas. 40% has now been shown to be a deeply insufficient cap for urban enrollment in a food security system. When Delhi introduced the possibility to apply, 72 lakhs, 7.2 million residents in Delhi have ration cards. The first thing we found is that 6.2 million applications were pending because of this 40% gap. So when Nidhi said you could take an adjacent criteria, the first relief went to the 6.2. So you have 7.2 million in the system, you have 6.2 just outside the system but in a government database. But what's important is an additional 5.9 million applied for the temporary e-coupon ration system, which meant that at the end, 8 of every 10 Delhi residents was either already marked by the state as food insecurity, was either trying to get into that system to be marked by food insecurity, or 3 weeks without income was declaring themselves to be food insecure. Now, this is an astonishing scale of vulnerability. So when we think about what universal social protection means, the first thing that our reports are showing is that the underestimation of vulnerability in urban areas is of a magnitude that we did not earlier think. And please remember, Delhi is one of the richest urban regions in the country. Right? The second thing about non-state actors that are really important for us is the point that Rashee has already made, so I won't repeat it. We must think of NSAs as infrastructures of social protection, which means that if you invoke the concept of the infrastructure, infrastructures can be networked to be efficient. What does that network look like? So when we think about using non-state actors in partnership with the state, what is the nature of that network? So that they don't function just as last mile, but actually as a way to expand post-crisis social protection. And the affirmation of the importance of collectivization, I think, is a second underline. Membership-based organizations acted in some ways like the state. They had audit cultures, they had accountability, they had members who demanded just like citizens demand from the state. This particular form of non-state institutional organization was crucial. And the point about the opportunity of new categories, expanded entitlements has been made. Can I go to the next slide, please? So what I want to say is two things at the end as we close. What would it take to think of making non-state actors infrastructure? Relief gives us 5 possibilities. These are not the only possibilities, but from our immediate archive. 1, if you would want non-state actors to work with you as a delivery partner for social protection, you've got to share the databases that you are working with. many non-state actors could not access those databases. But in the case, say, of Rajasthan, the Labour Department, desperate to give a 2,500 rupee cash transfers to domestic workers, reached out to the domestic worker union and said, can you give us a database of domestic workers, right? Now here, the question was, but the state was not willing to share its database of PDS beneficiaries, but wanted the non-state actors' database of domestic workers. So the question of the sharing of data becomes a key part of building infrastructure. Second, states need to direct financial public budget resources for specific social protection systems. Otherwise, donor dependence becomes very high as a criteria that can both exclude the universal in non-state delivery. It can also strengthen what we call the stability of the resource and its provision. Protections from the policing arm of the state. We had a very particular experience in the lockdown where the state was both the person calling you for help and the person, let's say, greeting you on the street when you try to deliver it. The policing arm of the state is very different from the administrative arm of the state, but for relief, the experience of the citizen is the same. So the state also has to begin to think particularly about how to balance its policing functions with its administrative and socioeconomic delivery functions. This is not just true of relief, this is true of all development work of the state, also true of its work in civil liberties as in socioeconomic delivery. And the question of thinking about trust, we are in an environment in which non-state actors are particularly often looked at first with the gaze of suspicion, even though during the pandemic, everyone from the Supreme Court to the Prime Minister's office spoke of the essential character. A large survey by the Center for Policy Research on the perception of the bureaucracy, a majority, 3 of every 4 IS officers surveyed, believed that non-state actors were essential partners for the government in pandemic and relief report. But again, the question is, how do you turn these partnerships into structured networks as opposed to ad hoc disaster relief mechanisms? But the question of the state, while the constraints and limitations of legislation and databases can feel constraining, they are also what make the state accountable. They are also what make the state dependable. Non-state actors do not always have structures for accountability and transparency that parallel the audit and legal binds of the state. We have to find what some scholars call soft regulation, that finds the ability to introduce accountability without the paralysis of overregulation that stymies efficiency. These questions of regulatory forms are critical, and so we don't also want to romanticize the provision of relief by non-state actors unless regulatory structures for accountability develop in tandem. Next slide, please. So final slide, what are our overall recommendations for relief to social protection? The first is the example we made about Delhi's numbers on food insecurity. Social protection cannot be based on poverty. Social protection must be based on vulnerability. That is precisely the distinction that we have made about the 5.9 million Delhi residents who would become food insecure, even though technically today they are not BPL card holders, today they are not PDS ration card holders. In the 90s, we used to call this the distinction between absolute and relative poverty. We have stopped talking about the proximity to crisis. So one of the big findings around COVID for us is very simple. COVID did not cause the crisis of social protection. The crisis of social protection preceded COVID. It may have deepened it, it may have sharpened it, but it did not cause it. So for the lives of a majority of urban residents, the line between crisis and the everyday is drawn in the sand. It is not a paradigm shifting break in the pandemic. The normal everyday is a proximity to poverty, which is measured by vulnerability as opposed to poverty. Many new government schemes have done this, but this has not entered our operational reality. So while many governments have vulnerability surveys, when you go back to PDS, you go back to BPL. And the point here again is about taking the conceptual notion of vulnerability into the design and operations of actually functioning bureaucratic systems. The second point is for the example of rent. We simply do not have a broad enough understanding of household level social protection. This means 2 things, like Kinjal said. One household does not get all the 4 components they need between rent, health, food, and wage, right? Individuals get one or the other entitlements. So one of the questions that really is key for us is that if we begin thinking of multidimensional poverty, what is the institutional delivery mechanism for a multidimensional entitlement? Does it mean moving from an individual to a household? There are key concerns here. There are gendered concerns of intra-household distribution patterns, etc. But it is pivotal for us here to say that without rent, social protection in the urban is basically destitution prevention. It cannot be transformative, it cannot be promotive, it cannot help families get socioeconomic mobility. One of the pandemic assertions that was completely unviable was an appeal from the government of India to forego rent. The problem is it's an appeal. And when the state appeals, you know delivery is in trouble. Because the question that happened is A, in the context of southern urban formations, 88% of rent in India is unrecorded, which means that you don't know who's on rent. There are no rental agreements that are in writing. So the waiving of rent is a discretion, not a right. It is legally unenforceable. And this goes back to the larger question that we are asking theoretically, is that what is social protection within informal urbanization? It cannot be designed in the way in which labor and employment-based social protection histories from Northern Europe and industrial Europe cannot travel globally. The basis of a lot of social protection theory has understood labor and workplace as the core delivery mechanisms. In context of informal employment and informal housing, neither the workplace nor the category of labor are self-evident, which means for us, theories of social protection must be rethought within conditions of informal urbanization, bringing together two things that are not often connected, informal employment, but also informal spatiality and housing. And connecting economic and spatial informality and rethinking social protection is our primary theoretical appeal, and that is the work we're moving on to next. Very quickly to close out, we've talked about the need to expand our current databases, the need to integrate those databases with examples of integration that have been very interesting, the need to invest in public institutions, which can be repurposed regardless of their originary function, the need to anticipate what the urbanist Renu Desai has called multi-locality. And so Renu Desai's argument is that the notion of migration is actually understanding the mobility of urban Indians between cities, and that most urban workers live what she calls multi-local lives, not a single direction and also not cyclical migration. I think this idea of multi-locality is a very profound challenge to the design and delivery of systems. Some of this is addressed as the question of portability of social protection benefits now, so the debate is beginning. The need to design new delivery mechanisms is pivotal. Too much of our attention, both on the movement side and the governance side, is to argue for greater rights and greater entitlements. These are pivotal, but there is no point in possessing rights that are not linked to delivery. If substantial entitlements are not reaching, then having a right to that entitlement is in effect only necessary but not sufficient. We want to urge more work on the everyday operations of actually existing systems. The work is not a more broader work on the notion of social protection, but on the actual practice of social protection. Third, we want to think a little bit about what it means to say universal when we say universal social protection. The appeal to the universal is very seductive, but what we find, like Rashee was saying, the more universal the reach, the smaller the entitlement. So the question then becomes that if universality is coming at the cost of inadequacy, then what is the use of that universality for actually helping household welfare? And the final part is about the urge to really say that social protection systems cannot be binary debates between states and markets or state actors and non-state actors. The questions have to be thought through networks and partnerships. The complexity of delivery demands this, and therefore thinking about new institution delivery patterns is key. And we'll end with the fact that we are trying as a team, our first instinct was to archive, was to bear witness, was to be present. But the future theoretical work that we'd like to do is to really begin to examine innovations around social protection in practice that work in our urban context marked by structural inequality, by entrenched spatial informality, by fragmented governance systems, by weak local urban governance systems, and by an intensive category of work that does not fit traditional understandings of labor and therefore does not fit traditional understandings of social security, social protection. Thank you for your attention. And we will stop and pause here and open up for the last half an hour to questions, both in the Q&A box and from the floor. Thank you very much. Folks, just raise your hand if you want to take any of the questions. And if we can take 2, 3 together, that would be useful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting and I look forward to reading the reports. So I had one question I was curious about the speciality of the social protection web and what are the lessons that we can learn about it from your experience with working through this project. I mean, I'm just thinking about that point at which you were talking about, the ability of the beneficiaries to reach the donors and sort of like, the donors, their web itself. And if you know where to go, then that becomes an important way in which you kind of, solve the problem of contacting the two of them and getting social protection. So I'm just curious if there were any lessons about that.
Hi, thanks for this great session. So my question actually stems, I'll take 20 seconds to give the context. So as part of the Maharashtra government I'm working on a scheme for street vendors, and it was very interesting. There's a scheme called PM Swanidhi, right, which was introduced by the ministry, central government during the COVID to give subsidized loans to street vendors who have been affected by the pandemic. And it was very interesting that when the second COVID lockdown came, so like Gautam also mentioned, all state governments were keen on announcing 1,000 rupees, 1,500 rupees to vulnerable street vendors, construction workers. So it was very interesting that the data which was being collected for an existing scheme, whose purpose was actually for loans and collaboration with the lending institutions, this data actually was asked to us by the IIHS, and then the minister actually announced, after checking with us, that how many street vendors have actually registered as an eligible application for this loan, and that data was used as a number to say that this many street vendors are going to get a cash transfer of 1,500 rupees over this particular period. Now my question actually stems from the idea of scale and time, because now this 1,500 rupees was received after the announcement. Almost it took a month's time, because there's a lot of technical gaps, right from creating, like we created 100 Google Sheets, then we sent it to 400 urban local bodies to ensure that the bank accounts is actually matching the bank account of the street vendor. But then, of course, eventually the rate of success was 90%. So almost like around 3.8 or 4 lakh street vendors actually received that 1,500 rupees. Now, if you think about the partnership with a non-state actor, like we are talking about this, how the collaboration can happen, there is one significant factor of politics, right? The political announcement, who makes the decision, because of whom that benefit is being transferred to that final beneficiary. So how does this intervene? One. And second, how does this scale and time factor can be worked on better in this collaboration between non-state actor and actor? Because clearly the scale which state has, non-state actor cannot reach, especially the kind of access which they have. So yeah, like a couple of thoughts there.
Hi.
My question was that where do you see the role of local elected representatives or municipal councillors in the provision of ration particularly? And do you see their political party networks as state actors, non-state actors, or somewhere in flux? And also, in cases where ration was sourced through such networks, where do you see the role of inclusion of identifying beneficiaries? Was there some sort of discretion? Or how do you see this political network operating during the COVID?
Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, I mean, the categories of state actors and non-state actors were drawn, but even among state actors, ASHA workers, primary school teachers who did a lot of the last mile delivery were particularly, their own vulnerability was something that I noticed in Uttar Pradesh. Primary school teachers were sent out to do electoral work, and thereafter a massive infection were affected by the infection. So how do you see, and a lot of them are not entitled to full protection of state. In a way, they are parastatal workers. So about them.
Do you mind if we do a quick round of responses? Yeah, before we lose them, and then we'll take 3 more. Yeah. Anyone want to jump in?
Go ahead.
So let me take this question of scale and time in the fiction. So I think this is exactly where the tension line is, right? So the more you think about the state, you are able to get ideally something that is not just larger in scale, but is identified as public, is protected as an entitlement that is accountable to you, right? So it's not just the question that state reaches larger numbers. When a state offers an entitlement, there is a legitimacy that comes with it and allows you a certain accountability to it, right? And it has the ability to remain and enter into public function. But when you start looking at identification, the appeal of that identification by the state to be in the database is very powerful. But when you start looking at delivery, that precise scale begins. So when we think about agility and flexibility, right? So the question is that there are 2 things we'd like to say here. One is the same state that is very slow to move normally did start moving faster and during relief. So even within the state, departments found a way to talk to each other. Databases found a way to be interlinked. Suddenly committees started getting created. Suddenly, if you just think, we read 161 government orders in 3 months. That's a very fast state. So one of the lessons we're also trying to figure out is when the state wants to move with agility, it has the institutional DNA to do so. So the question you're also trying to do with the research is to say, how do you hold on to a state that suddenly has an ease to do interdepartmental meetings that you otherwise cannot pay love or money to make happen? Right? So I think the question of integration is not just the integration of benefit, it's a particular kind of governance integration that occurred, and we're still trying to pass through the legacies of that. And what's interesting now is many of those governments have announced new schemes where suddenly 2 departments are working together. And you're saying, how did this scheme happen? It happened because during COVID, they met each other. And during COVID, they did a relief program together. And they're like, you know what, let's do more of this. So I think there's an interesting question to use relief to push the state within itself to think about questions of integration. Because the thing about integration is something has to hold it. Either the entitlement has to be jointly held, or the budget has to be jointly held, or the governance committee structure has to be joint, or the plan has to be joint. Something has to hold. The plan, the budget, the entitlement, the process. Integration has to sit somewhere. Otherwise, it's just notional. So I think one of the big things about that was to offer and say, integrate through this. Integrate. So should we tell the government to converge by mixing their databases? Should we tell the government to converge by jointly delivering something on the ground, right? So I think those lessons are really important for us in terms of scale. The question of politics is central to this. I mean, when we say that we want to use this data to push, relief is a political opportunity. Because once you've given something, there's an entitlement. So in Delhi, we keep saying there are 5.9 million people who have a QR code on their phone that once got them ration. They're not going to forget that. They've got that piece of paper. Now, they are going back to the state and saying, if you could give it to me in 2020, why can't you give it to me in 2022? Has my vulnerability decreased? You have my Aadhaar card, you have my number, here's my QR code, I'm showing up to you again. So now there's a new question of pushing. So the politics also gets created in particular moments. The 3 categories that already had political mobilization, vendors, construction workers, and transport workers, have been building that political movement for 10 years before COVID hit. Yeah. Right? Now, the National Street Vending Act was passed because of the mobilization of unions that did that. So what's interesting for us here, again, it goes back to that question of saying that the question of political will of the state, to us, relief is showing you that it's built over this period of time. It's not about leadership, it's not about parties, it's not about a good chief minister. It's about the conditions of possibility that surround the state. And that, I think, is what's important. I wouldn't look for the answer of politics inside the state. I would look on how you bring that question from outside it.
No, just to answer both your questions. In fact, I felt like they complemented each other. You spoke about party workers acting as almost an extension of state, and para-state workers almost becoming NSA. And I think one of our appeals, which is to think of delivery and the entire supply chain, the delivery chain, as an infrastructure, and what are these actors doing as a set of infrastructure. The reason why they do not have protection is because delivery itself is under, sort of designed. And once you actually enter delivery as a design piece, that is essential right from the politics of it, which is that there's no point of having an entitlement and a right without it actually getting the material realization of it in the form that it is supposed to. Then we start seeing each of these as infrastructures of delivery and how do we actually connect them. So I think that would be my response to it, but do add to it. Yeah,
I just want to add to that when we were doing our research with the non-state actors, we did not find instances where, the urban locally elected members were reached. People didn't think of them as points where they could go and say, help. This is where I can seek help. And we also have examples where when we talk about, just political parties and political workers who were doing some form of relief, who were not elected but were doing some form of relief, would then sort of have these negative lists of, you have a voter ID card here or don't you have a voter ID card here? And that was something that we saw as well. So,
final last thing on spatiality before we take more questions is that, so the spatiality becomes a really critical part of the design of the social protection system. One of the reasons why our emphasis on public institutions came up is partly because public institutions are not just public and local and accountable, they're typically spatially located in a distribution that is very useful for social protection. So municipal schools became hunger relief centers because they are within a walkable distance of most vulnerable neighborhoods. So there are particular kind of public institutions whose spatial geography is already imagined as being accessible, particularly to vulnerability. So I think what's important about the spatiality question was that if you were to say and design an integrated social protection delivery system, instead of thinking, separately about things like the primary health center, the primary school, the local ration shop, there is a constellation of public institutions which by definition are meant to be intimately located close to people. So that proximity is inbuilt into them. The problem is that they are not seen as part of a social protection delivery system. They are seen as individualized public institutions. The public school does education but does not do X. So, the fact that the other thing that happened in COVID is, remember, vaccination overlapped with the same public institutions. So we're learning something about the way public institutions take advantage of a certain spatiality that is inbuilt into their public character. But these are local public institutions. And I think this is that other key. The public institutions that play this role all have the word primary in front of them, right? Or have the word municipal in front of them. So as public institutions scale to the more complex, they lose this spatial connection with that geographical distribution. So I think that's one reflection. There's lots more to say about spatiality.
Gautam, just to add from the NSA, again, this is anecdotal, right? But in terms of spatiality, we got calls where we heard people say that I am in the periphery of Bangalore, hence my slum is not, or my settlement is not covered, and I'm not able to get access even from the non-state actors, because people largely focused on denser areas wherever they were able to reach faster. There were instances where people said that we are in this factory location, we are inside and we're not able to get out, but the employer won't take care of their food needs, and others are not able to reach because they don't know where they are, and all of this because of the restrictions on mobility, right? So I think spatiality played a huge factor, and like Gautam said, I think this is linked to the point on databases, right? A lot of these get affected because of just merely where people are and how they're moving.
Just adding to the spatiality point, apart from delivery of relief, spatiality is also critical and also by state actors used for identifying beneficiaries. For example, and there is a very strong overlap with occupational categories in this. For example, when transport workers surveys were conducted, they or street vendors or any of those particular occupational categories were targeted for relief. Where they work versus where they live is a critical question then that comes in terms of the spatial way of thinking about also identifying beneficiaries. Similarly, for waste workers ke liye, this is a non-state thing, but they delivered these at spaces which are also like Bhalswa mein Vastu Suraksha Manch delivered entitlements, but it was also very spatial concentration of occupation categories. So I think that is a learning that even state actors have employed in other ways.
I'm going to hold us because we want to take 3 more questions from the floor before we lose them. Yeah. Okay, can we take some from the floor and I'll read one here? Okay. How we found the collection on, so where we found the announcements, okay, so that we can just take a look about the criteria. Can we scroll down? Whether the category of migrant, let's pick this one, yeah. So should we think of this as a migrant crisis or a social protection crisis? And did we find that the category of migrant was a salient because it was often described as a migrant crisis? So we take this one, these 2 from there. Do you want to take something from there?
First. Okay.
Oh, hi. Wonderful work. Thank you so much. My questions are like from Mars, you know. You're having very complicated discussion about all sorts of entitlements and systems and so on. So what's the debate about a basic income grant? Cut through all this stuff. Where's the housing program to solve some of these informality of housing and rental issues? So I'm just wondering, you know, outside of this particular research project or box, how does the conversation happen?
The question has actually been answered in a way, but a point of view is that how do we identify vulnerability as compared to putting BPL as poverty in itself being an identifier of vulnerability. Hence, like the millions of numbers that you mentioned about people in Delhi filing for vulnerability, many of them were actually hoarding resources and depending on the government in order to get extra privilege. So how do you actually kind of quantify or identify who is actually vulnerable and who is actually, you know, using the system?
Sure. One last one because we won't have time to answer the rest. Yeah. Good.
You mentioned a point about like how the proximity to vulnerability is something that we are maybe like one crisis or one shock away, right? So based on the question of capacity, right? How do you see the current non-state actors that you looked at, right? And it was a very diverse group that you looked at. How successfully can the more thicker ones, right, could train, maybe build certain skills, right? Like maybe a technological intervention could be just setting up a website for an NGO, but that 15,000 is a lot for an NGO to maybe pull out for a website. But maybe a CSR intervention or a program at a large scale could build those capacities in NGOs which work on women's self-help groups, for example. So how do you see those experiences expanding, and can that lead to some form of integration as well?
Sure. Okay, so just because I know we have about 6 minutes, so I'll take a couple. We go down the line. So very quickly, I think one, to take Jenny's question on basic income. So one of the big 2 things I think have stayed with us as a group at the end of it. So when we talked about the seduction of the universal, right, and this is partly the basic income question, 2 things came to us. One, the actual delivery of cash entitlements is not a smooth digital highway of ease. In fact, the levels of delivery frictions, I can tell you that on a side example, we tried to work with the Domestic Workers Union, where the union had money to give to 500 identified older domestic workers. All the women were banked, all the women were union members, all the women had every document at the start, and yet it took 6 months to get the cash transfers in. The bank IFSC codes changed, 3 public sector banks merged, 1 bank account had gotten dormant. So this notion of the smoothness of the digital is mythical, particularly again in the particular structures of our economic and social polity. UPI has made a huge difference. One is not saying that technology is absolutely a central part of this, but if we're going to make technology work universally, we have to treat it as a delivery infrastructure to be designed, just like every other one, right? It's not going to come without its issues. But the other big problem for us was that entitlements in kind play a pivotal vulnerability alleviation role that entitlements in cash do not substitute. This is repeatedly something we've seen. In many cases, one of the things that and this goes back to the notion of how you think about vulnerability in some ways. The two concerns with universalism for us are here. One is the fact that street vendors got their entitlements as street vendors also builds a political subjectivity for their occupational status, which is then the way they use to claim rights to workplaces, rights to housing, rights to rent, and rights to minimum wage. So the categories in which, so one of the questions we ask is, who do you ask for social protection as? Right? And citizen is a great answer. But it's very important for street vendors to say as street vendors, because then the recognition of informal employment is caught up in the recognition of social protection. So we struggle between saying, do we go sector by sector, street vendor different, domestic worker different, transport worker different, or do we just say workers? The problem is at this point that abstraction to workers loses the political agency particular occupations get within informal employment. So there is not a desire at this point to move quickly to the citizen, but to hold on to the worker as the claimant of social protection, because then other rights that's where the politics to it in some sense gets built. Because then a street vendor becomes a recognizable type of citizen and cannot be made a beneficiary, but has to be called a worker. And that's a really important subjectivity question that we're thinking about.
I think there's another...
So just one last line I want to say on vulnerability is this question of hoarding and taking advantage of the system. I think that in the context of our wage inequalities, I think we have to think about the ethics of this question and asking it. Think about who we're talking about. You're talking about people who braved a lockdown, braved the police, to stand in the heat in front of a public school, risked disease, risked the cops in order to get 5 kilos of wheat, 5 kilos of ration, 1 liter of oil. If you think that hoarding of that is a kind of privilege, then I think we have a mistaken idea of what co-option is. This was a base entitlement of ration. I don't think you can hoard ration. You should have as much of it as you want. So I think that the concern in social protection systems about this question of the co-option is deeply overemphasized. And actually, I'll go out on a personal limb. I do not care about 15% false inclusion errors. I care about 1% of a type 1 error, where someone who's vulnerable is left out. If 10 people who are not take it and take ration, it's fine. So I think this debate about type 1, type 2 errors, really we need to let go of it. When we have a wage structure where 80% of our citizens are not EWS, then we'll worry about hoarding. At this point, I think we have to go totally the other way. Yeah.
No, I just want to add to your previous point that this notion of citizen is also juxtaposed against the very federal nature of our country. So are you a citizen of the ward? Are you a citizen of the city? Are you the citizen of the state that you live in? Or are you the citizen of the country? Because if you see the NSAP, the National Social Assistance Program of pension, it's at 7 rupees per day, or 200 rupees is what the central government gives. But the states top up, and post-pandemic, the states are giving about 2,000, 2,500 would be the average. And especially when you talk about workers who are living in all of these places and are multi-local, then the notion of citizen starts to kind of, be mediated by these categories. And therefore, the very specificity of a category of I live in this neighborhood, I am a slum resident, I am a domestic worker starts gaining traction much more than a universal right.
And I think one thing that one can think about is if there are better ways to measure vulnerability, we're offering you 3. Use occupation as a proxy, use spatial residence and neighborhood vulnerability as a proxy, and then also use income as a proxy. Not to rely only on income with multidimensional various ways, but one weight that is practice-worthy, which is easy to do as a practitioner. Occupation, neighborhood, income. If we can find 1 or 2 or 3 of these ways, then I think it's a better way to move quickly with a definition of vulnerability that's not just conceptually robust, but a state can use to actually design a system, right? Because there are deep restrictions there. Nidhi, last words?
That's what I wanted to talk about.
Okay, so I think the closing thing that we've got to take, because we're right at time, is just to answer the question on the online chat about whether this is a migrant or a social protection crisis. I think it's a very tricky debate. I don't have an opinion on it one way or the other. I don't know if anyone else in the panel does. Because one would love for the base political category to be somewhere between citizen and worker. But the question of the migrant is has very real implications, particularly on state delivery, because of the fact that, especially during the lockdown, the state borders actually acted as very hard borders. And there, then the question of the fact of something being a migrant both affected delivery but also affected claims. So I don't think we can yet move away from the idea of migrant. I think it's a category that has an everyday life that's deep. But I think that the idea of not being surprised by migration, but anticipating it as a structural condition of urbanization. We should assume that people move, not say, here's a system that delivers, now you've moved so you don't fit into the system. Actually, the system should be designed to anticipate movement. That is one of the fundamental structures of urbanization, is the certainty of mobility. So I think that we have made a mistake in really thinking, scholars have called this the stationary bias in social protection. Why, instead of saying, oh, people are moving, we should begin and say, given that people move, what is social protection? So I think that's the way I would think about it. And if this crisis can push us towards that, we'll have done well.
I want to just quickly add that with the scale of the crisis of what we saw in the lockdowns, it's also easy to lose the fact that this movement takes so many different forms. Like, of course, absolutely. The most dramatic and the most sort of dire has kind of come to dominate our understanding of migration, but yeah, people move in so many different ways for so many different reasons. Absolutely. And that needs to be acknowledged.
All right, we are exactly at time, and so thank you all very much for the questions as well as your attention, and thank you for listening to us this morning. One last thing, folks, both the reports are publicly available for free accessible download. There's 2 physical copies in my hand. The links to them have been put in the chat. And for any of you who are in the room, IIHS Knowledge Gateway has all our publications, including both the reports. So please feel free to read, download, photocopy, circulate. We would be very happy to hear them.
Yeah, I also had an acknowledgement slide just to sort of acknowledge that there are others who were part of this work who are not able to be here. So that's Harshal, Rashmi, and Krishna, Priya, and Antara. So, and also just wanted to acknowledge that I was lucky enough to be part of this work as an outgoing IIHS UFP student, and this was really a strange time to be doing research in April, May, June. So this was my main community online. So this is collective work, as I was repeatedly told. I'm just grateful to be part of that. So thank you. Thanks for that.
Thank you.